Hi there, and welcome back to another video. In our last video, we started looking at the first steps to making a game with Godot. We installed Godot, looked at Godot's UI, and got basic player movement set up with animations and user input. In this video, we look at setting up the simple dialogue system, the game's UI, managing pickups, and do some playtesting and refactoring. Let's jump right in. Now let's work on showing the dialogue. This is going to be really simple. Let's create a dialog box that looks like this. We begin by adding a canvas layer node to the root node. This is where we will hold all our UI elements, and a panel node as a child of it. Rename the panel node to dialog box 1, then go to the anchor presets and choose full rect. In this way, we'll create a background. Next, we add another panel node as a child of the dialog box and call it dialog 1. This is where we'll display our text. In the inspector, on the layout, we change the size to 600 on the X and 200 on the Y, and set the anchor presets to center. We then add a label node as a child of dialog 1. This is where we'll actually write our text, and add the text to the text box in the inspector. In the theme overrides, we can increase the font size to 40 so that it's a little easier to see, and change the anchor presets to center. Now let's put an image so the player knows which character is talking. We add a textdirect node as a child of the dialog 1, rename it to character, and drag the player character idle sprite into the texture field in the inspector. Then change its scale to 0.3 and its position to -35 on the X and -20 on the Y. And finally, we add a button to close the dialog box. We do this as a child of dialog 1 and add the text in the text box in the inspector. In the theme overrides, we can change the font size to 30, and in the visibility, we change the color to red. In the layout transform, we can also increase the size of the button, and then set its anchor presets position to the bottom right. And that's it for the first dialog box. Your dimensions and positions may vary if you're using different art assets. We are going to need 3 dialog boxes for our game, so all we need to do is duplicate the dialog box a couple times. We can toggle off the visibility of each of the dialog boxes by clicking on the eye icon to the right, so that it's easier to see them individually, and change the text in the label nodes to match our story. In the last box, we can also change the image to the NPC Joe's idle sprite image. Now that we have our dialog boxes set up, let's work on a way to show them at the appropriate time. We can start our game with the dialog box 1 visible and the game paused, so that the player is not able to move. To do this, we create an empty node as a child of the root node, call it Game Manager, and add a script to it by clicking the Add Script button. We will create 2 functions in the script, a pause function that gets the tree and sets pause to true, and an unpause function that sets pause to false. And in the ready function that gets called when the game first starts, we'll call the pause function. Then we right-click on the Game Manager and click on Access as Unique Name. This will allow access to the Game Manager by using its name in scripts. Now, since the game will be started in a paused state, we want the canvas layer and all its children to be active when the game is paused. So, in the inspector, we'll need to set its process mode to when paused. Next, we rename the button to Close Button 1. Add a script to the button, and in the inspector, we go to the Node tab and add an unpressed signal, and connect the signal to the Close Button 1. The signal creates an unpressed function in the script. We then create a reference to the Game Manager by dragging the Game Manager while holding the Control key and dropping it into the script. Now, we just call the unpause function from the Game Manager when the button is pressed. And lastly, we will hide the dialog box by creating a reference to it and calling the hide function to turn off the visibility when the button is pressed. When we play the game is paused at the start, and when we click the close button, the game is unpaused and the player can move. Now let's add the pickup. An area 2D node is perfect for this. Rename it to pickup, and then add a sprite 2D node as a child of it. Then we drag the mushroom sprite into the texture field of the sprite 2D node. The area 2D node needs a collision shape, So let's add one. I will set a circle shape to it and adjust it so that it covers the mushroom. Before I go on, feast your eyes at my epic level building skills as I make the level 100% more interesting. And for those of you wondering how I got the player to go behind the trees and the arrow signs and in front of the bushes, I just used the Z index of the ordering in the inspector of the sprites to layer them, leaving the player at 0 and using positive and negative values for the other sprites. Okay, enough of that. Now let's get back to business. To get the pickups working, we'll need to set things up in the Game Manager script. First, we'll store the number of mushrooms in an integer variable called mushroom number. And in the process function, we can check if mushroom number is less than 0, then the mushroom number is equal to 0. That way it doesn't go into a negative value for any reason. Next, we add a script to the pickup and connect an onBody entered signal to it. We check if the body entered has the name player, and then we add 1 to the Game Manager mushroom number. We call queue_free on the mushroom to remove it from the scene. We can print the value to the console to see the mushroom number. Now would be a great time to pause the game and show the second dialog box. To do this, we will call the pause function from the Game Manager and show the dialog box by getting a reference to it and calling the show function. Can you remember how to hide the dialog box? Well, that's the next step, and we're almost done. Please feel free to pause the video and use the timestamps again for revision if you need to. Okay, let's continue. We just need to rename the button in the dialog box 2 to close button 2 and add a script to the button. It will be a lot similar to the code for the dialog box 1. The only change is that we'll need to get a reference to dialog box 2 and call the hide function on it. Okay, so now that the dialog box is gone, let's show that Jane picked up a mushroom. And to do this is super easy. We will use some of the things that we've learned already about UI. First, let's create a new panel node as a child of the canvas layer. To display the mushroom, rename it to pickup box and leave its anchor presets to top left and resize it to 75 on the X and 50 on the Y. Then we add a texture rect node as a child of the pickup box and rename it to mushroom, and drag the mushroom sprite into the texture field in the inspector. Change the expand mode to ignore size and change its anchor presets to middle left. Next, add a label node as a child of the pickup box and enter the number 1 in the text box in the inspector. Change its horizontal alignment to right and the vertical alignment to center. In the layout transform, we can make the box a little smaller than the panel, like 70 on the X and 50 on the Y. And in the theme overrides, we can change the font size to 30. Now let's update this UI when Jane collects the mushroom. First, rename the label to mushroom number, and in the pickup script, create a reference to it. Then in the script, after we add 1 to the Game Manager mushroom number, we can update the text by setting the mushroom number text equal to the Game Manager mushroom number. We will need to convert the integer to a string, and we do this by using str followed by the integer to convert in brackets. Now all we need to do is change the text to 0 and play the game. The UI displays that Jane has no mushrooms, and when she collects the mushroom, the UI is now updated. So far it's been great, and I've been having a lot of fun, and I hope you are too. If you liked the video, don't forget to drop it a like, it really helps out, and also subscribe if you want to visit me again. Now, let's see about Joe. Joe will have a lot in common with the pickup, so I think we could just duplicate the pickup and make a few changes. First, we'll remove the script and disconnect the signal. Then, we can drag Joe's idle sprite into the texture field of the Sprite 2D node in the inspector and adjust the scale. Change the shape of the collision shape to a new capsule shape and position it over Joe. And now, we can place Joe over by the tree to catch some shade. I think that the best way to introduce Joe is to have him introduce himself whenever the player comes into contact with him. Let's make the dialog box first. We can duplicate the dialog box 3 and change the text to say, "Hi, I'm Joe. Can you bring that mushroom to me?" Oh my, what a nice guy. Now we will use signals to handle showing the dialog box. But we'll do it a little differently this time. We add a script to Joe. I will just call it NPC Manager and rename the collision shape attached to Joe to Dialog Trigger. In the NPC Manager script, we grab a reference to the dialog box 4 and create an on-body entered and on-body exited signals. We will also need a reference to our game manager script. In the on-body entered, make a function such that if the player enters the dialog trigger and has no mushrooms, the dialog box 4 will be shown by calling the show function on the dialog box 4. In the on-body exited, hide the dialog box when the player exits the dialog trigger and also has no mushrooms. Now, we get a reference to dialog box 3 and use an else statement to show the dialog box 3 and call the pause function from the game manager if the player has a mushroom. We can also hide the buttons on the dialog box 3 and 4 because we will not be using them for now. Now all that's left to do is test the game to make sure all is working well. The game starts paused and we click to close the dialog box and unpause the game. We go over to Joe and the dialog box 4 is shown because we have not collected any mushrooms. When we exit the dialog trigger, the dialog box 4 is hidden, and we go on to help our pal Joe get the mushroom. Upon collecting the mushroom, the UI is updated and the game is paused. We click close and the dialog box is hidden and the game is unpaused. Then we go back to Joe. When we enter the dialog trigger, the dialog box 3 is shown because we now have a mushroom and the game is paused. After our first playtest, we will start to notice all the things that we would like to change, like things that break the immersion or flow of the gameplay. It is important to step back and see the game through the eyes of a gamer, not a game dev that spent countless hours trying to get the thing to work. The first thing that I noticed is if we leave the dialog box 1 hidden, it is not shown when we start the game. This is definitely not good, and luckily, this is also a very easy fix. All we need to do is go to the game manager script and get a reference to it by dragging and dropping the dialog box 1 into the game manager script while holding the control key. And in the ready function, just call the show function on dialog box 1. And that's it. The next thing is that at the moment we need to use the mouse to close the dialog box. And while this works, I think it's a bit immersion breaking. So let's make it possible to close the dialog box by pressing the enter key. First, we set up a new input action by going to Project Settings, Input Map. I will call it Enter and click Add. Next, configure the input by clicking the plus button and hitting the Enter key on the keyboard. Click OK and close the window. In the inspector, change the text on the button to Enter. Then go to Shortcut and create a new shortcut. Click on Shortcut and create a new event array and add element. Then create a new input event action and give it the name Enter, which we just created. Now when we play the game, we can close the window by either using the mouse or pressing the Enter key. Also make the same change for dialog box 2. Then there's a player controller. I noticed if the player is touching a box and jumps, the player is not able to jump up on the box. This happens because at the moment, to avoid being able to move the player in the air after jumping, we made a bool can move, and only move the player if can move is true. In the physics process function, we set can move to true only when the player is on the floor. So now to fix this, what we can do is in the physics process function, we can set can move to true when the player touches a wall. To do this, we use another very convenient built-in function in Godot, isOnWall, and set can move to true if isOnWall is also true. Now when we play the game, we're able to jump on the boxes when the player touches the boxes or walls made of boxes. If all this seems a bit confusing, I explain how I set up the player movement in greater detail in part 1 of this series. Now that we've got things set up, let's take a closer look at the scene tree. I use the Z-index in the ordering of the different sprite objects, like the trees, bushes, and signs, to give the effect of depth. The player has a Z ordering index of 0, so by giving the object sprites either a positive value, I can place them in front of the player sprite, or a negative value to place them behind the player sprite. I needed to set the background texture rect ordering Z index to -10, so that it would be behind all the other sprites. A yellow triangle appeared next to the texture rect node. This really is not a big deal for now, because it really does not affect the game. All this warning says is that changing the Z index of a control node only affects the drawing order, and not the input event handling order. But let's change the node type to a sprite node, since in this case, it's really not necessary to use a control node for the background. To do this, we just right-click on the texture rect node and choose Change Type. Search for a sprite node, select it, and click Change. All we need to do now is adjust its transform so that it fits the frame, and leave the Z index ordering at -10 so that it's behind everything else. We can also tidy up the scene tree by grouping all the sprites together. First, let's create an empty node as a child of the root node and rename it to Objects. Select all the objects and make them children of the object node by dragging them under the object node. That way, we can collapse the object node to tidy up the scene tree. We can also do the same for the tile maps. Now there's one last thing that I'd like to do. Let's make the pickup and Joe separate scenes. This way, it will be easier to reuse them at later points in the game if needed. To do this is really easy. All we do is right-click on the pickup node and choose Save Branch as Scene and save it in the Scenes folder. We'll do the same for Joe. And there you have it. Everything is nice and tidy. One thing that I have not been mentioning is that you need to remember to save your progress often. That way, you don't lose any of your work. You will notice a star next to the name in the Scene tab if you have unsaved work. To save, you just click Ctrl S on the keyboard with the tab selected, or go to Scene and choose Save Scene As, or Save All Scenes, depending on your situation. Now I know this player controller is not perfect, and to be completely honest, playtesting is only part of the final step. But we've covered so much till now, and there's still a lot more to do. So if you liked the video, give it a like, subscribe, and leave me a comment on what you would like to see next. And if we get to 500 likes, that would be amazing, and I promise to continue this series. We could probably improve the player controller, add hazards, or even add a more advanced dialogue system, or even a menu and switch scenes. It's all up to you. Thanks for watching and making it to the end, and I look forward to seeing you right here again.